with a little bit of halacha l'maisa. So we ran through, I ran through the daf yesterday a little bit quickly, and I'd like to spend a few moments to close this. At least you walk away with the halacha l'maisa from yesterday's daf. So I will say, just remember again, yesterday's daf, and the truth is the daf before as well, so I mean the daf from Wednesday as well as from Tuesday, focused a lot on the concept of standing in one rishus, and doing something in a different rishos, and the restrictions on that. So I just want to quote to you. This is the Shulchan Aruch in Shin Nun, Siman Shin Nun, Aruch Haim Shin Nun. So I'm going to read to you two quick seifim in Shulchan Aruch, and that will close out the sugya. Omed Adam b'Rishus Hayachid u'motzi yad l'Rishus Harabim u'metaltel sham chafatzim. So a person could stand in one rishus. In this case, his example is a person could stand in Rishus Hayachid and ultimately again extend his hand into the Rishus Harabim and move objects around there. Now the Shulchan Aruch here gives a very important qualification to this halacha. She'inam tzrichen lamakom shu'omed. You can only do this with utensils that you don't need in the place where you are standing. So for example, if I'm standing in Rishus Hayachid, I could manipulate and move utensils in Rishus Harabim as long as those are not utensils that I need in the Rishus Hayachid. We'll say, of course, the logic being, because as long as I don't need it, there's no concern that I'm going to come to move it from one domain to another. Shenot la mikam menechem lekan. So that's caveat number one. Caveat number one is only applies to utensils you don't need in the domain in which you are standing. Caveat number two, obilvat shel ya'avirim arba amos. Of course, caveat number two is you can't move it more than dalet amos in the Rishus Harabim. V'lo chashinan shem yavim elav. We're not concerned you're going to come to take the utensil to you. Kevan shenim tzrichen lo b'makom shu'omei. Since you don't need it in a place where you are standing. Hilchach mutter. So we'll say this goes now to yesterday's daf. So that's the first principle. That's from 2 days ago. Principle number one is you can stand in one domain, move an object less than dalet amos in another domain, provided that you do not need the object in the domain in which you are standing. What's a good? So we'll say when we first see this, we wonder why does anyone need to do it. So this goes back to yesterday's daf. Hilchach mutter lamod b'rishus harabim litol mafteach b'rishus hayachid v'liftoach shem. We'll say, where does this come up? I'm standing in the public domain and I want to unlock a door in the Rishus Hayachid. But in order to unlock the door, I have to be metatal, I have to move the key. So can I stand in one domain, move an object in a second domain? So which the Shulchan Aruch says, yes, you can stand in Rishus Harabim and move a key in Rishus Hayachid. V'chein Rishus Harabim. So we'll say, aval lo ya'amo b'Rishus Hayachid. Fine. So we'll say, so therefore, that is halacha number one. Halacha number one is that you could go ahead and stand in one domain, move an object less than dalet amos in another domain, provided you do not need the object in the domain in which you are standing. Where does this come up? We'll say yesterday's daf, opening doors. You could see a mitzias where you'd be standing in one domain, want to open up the key, the door in another domain, which would require you to go ahead and move the key. So again, the Shulchan Aruch says it's mutter as long as halacha l'maisa, you're moving the key less than dalet amos. And I will say the assumption is the key is not something you're going to bring into your domain, right? Why not? Because the key is necessary in the domain in which the door is situated, not in the domain in which you are standing. That's one. Next. I will say, what can't you do? You can't stand in Rishus Hayachid and stick your head out into Rishus Harabim and drink there. So we'll say this was 2 days ago we had this Gemara. So you can't stand in one domain and drink in another domain. Ella imkin yachnis roshav ruben l'makom shu shoseh. Because we'll say, unless of course you move your head and the majority of body to the domain in which you are drinking. We'll say now the logic is very intuitive. Essentially, what the halacha says is, you could stand in one domain and do things in a different domain, as long as there is no concern you're going to move objects from one domain to another. So if you're drinking, if I'm standing in Rishus Harabim and my head is in Rishus Hayachid and I'm drinking there, there's absolutely a concern that what? I'm going to bring that drink with me back into the domain in which I am standing, unless of course I'm standing in one domain, but the majority of my body is extended into the next domain. Then under those circumstances, where we are confident that you'll finish drinking where the majority of your body is, and you won't transition. Fine. So we'll say, so ultimately, the Shulchan Aruch then goes on, one last case, then we'll close out the two last cases. So we'll say, so that's halacha number one. Dealing with standing in one domain and utilizing objects in the next domain. Next case we had, which was from 2 days ago, what about urinating from one domain to another? So here the Shulchan Aruch says, Lo ya'amot adam b'rshus harabim v'yashtin o yorak b'rshus hayachid. A person should not stand in rshus harabim and urinate or spit into a different rshus, right? Into rshus hayachid, o bekarmelis, o ibcha, afilu im hotzi piyam asal l'chutz. I will say, this is true even if the aver extends into a different domain. I will say, this is actually very interesting. They're talking about from urinating from one domain to another. So I will say, ultimately, again, that's not situated from where the actual aver is situated, but rather, again, is focused on where your bladder is. Right? So ultimately, if your bladder is in Rishus Hayochid, and ultimately you're urinating in Rishus Harabim, even if the urine is literally exiting your body in Rishus Harabim, halacha l'maaseh, that's called an act of otzah, since the urine is uprooted from the bladder and ultimately extends out. So that's halacha number 2. Don't urinate from one domain to another. Good. What about spitting? So we'll say this is the last case. Roko shenit lash befevu muchan lazarko. We'll say what about saliva which has accumulated in my mouth and is ready to be expelled? Ready to be expelled. Yesh misha omer shelo yelich dalar amos b'shusuram achi yarok. So there are those who say that really you should not go ahead and walk more than dalar amos in Rosh Hashanah before expelling it. Right before expelling it. So that's the third case I will say. Now the Mishnah Berurah comments on that case. He says it's not just that if it accumulates. Remember, the lashon the Gemara used of nishapech. Nishapech means literally you swirled it around in your mouth. So the fact that you have saliva accumulated in your mouth, that's not a problem. And so if you have saliva and what the Gemara calls you swirled it, meaning so now it's really all made to be expelled, you should not walk dalit amis without first expelling that from your mouth. So I will say, so those are our 3 halachas. Halachas concerning standing in one domain and 4 halachas. Utilizing a key in a different domain, standing in one domain and drinking in a different domain, standing in one domain, urinating in another domain, standing in one domain, spitting in another domain, and I guess 5 halachas. And halacha number 5, ultimately again about walking around with accumulated saliva in your mouth. Good, I'll say. We'll stop over there. We'll start the halacha over there. Now let's begin the daf. Thank you for accommodating the early start. That way, at least, although we went quickly in yesterday's daf, at least you emerge with the bottom line halacha l'maisa. So we'll say, let's begin. Another very interesting sugya today. Today's daf is Kuf Beis 102. We are starting again at the Mishnah on Kuf Aleph Amud Beis 101b. Says the Mishnah, Nagar sheyesh berosho glustra. We'll say, now Nagar is a bolt. A door bolt. So we'll see again, I will say that bolts were used in different ways for different things. So we'll say, so the Gemara says as follows, Nagar sheyesh barosha glustra. So if you go ahead and, so I just have to mention to the Chevron Zoom that it's, it's the schos to have Reb Jerry Walaski and David Kahana on, for most of us here, we have not been zocha to get to Eretz Yisrael in many months, and I see Jerry's giving me his background that he's learning by the coastal over here. You can't see it, so you can't see it on Zoom, but I can see it. I have the great chance to look at this. Baruch Hashem. It's well, okay. Halavai, we should be zochim Meretz Hashem to all be there together. B'karov. So I'll say. So the Mishnah says, Nagar sheish barosha glustra. So if you go ahead and you have a bolt, and the bolt has a glustra, and I'll say glustra is a knob. Thank you. Glustra is a knob. So we'll say you're going to see why this is significant in just a moment. Now, but Pashtos, the role of the knob is that it allows you to go ahead and utilize the bolt. So the Gemara Rabbi Eliezer, Oser Rabbi Yossi Mat. Rabbi Eliezer says that it's Aser, meaning I will say that it's Muktzah. But Rabbi Yossi says that it's mutter. And I will say, look at Rashi. We're going to do a number of Rashis today. I'm going to slow down the pace from yesterday a little bit. So Rashi says over here, Sheyesh barosho glustra, sherosho ava veroi lebuchna, velichtosh velishchok bo palpulin, vafilu hachi de Torres klialar belazer oser. So let's listen to this. So the idea of the knob is that the knob allows it to be used as a utensil, allows it to be used as a kliaros. We did this in Smichas Chaver on Monday night. That so much of Hilchos Muktzah comes down to the ability of something to be defined as a kli, as a utensil. So here, interestingly enough, because the bolt has a knob on the end of it, it has the designation of a kli. So therefore, again, as a result of that, Rabbi Yossi Matir, Rashi says, the Torah's kli alav mishum gustra v'lo michsi kibon. I both say, now the issue over here in the Mishnah is not muktzah. The issue over here in the Mishnah is bona. See, here's the issue. When you take a bolt, when you put a bolt into the door, so is that viewed as an act of building or not? To which the machlokes over here is like this. Rabbi Yossi will say, as long as there's a knob at the end of that bolt, so that the bolt has the appearance of a kli, of a utensil, then when you insert that into the door, into the threshold, that doesn't look like an act of binyan. Conversely, Rabbi Eliezer says that it is still aser. It is still aser. Now again, we'll discuss why that isn't just a bit. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Eliezer says, Maise b'knesses shebetiveria. There was once an episode in a shul in Tiberia, shayu noagin boheter, that they used to go ahead and take the bolt and put the bolt in and out. Ad sheba Rabbi Gamliel v'askinu v'asru lahem. Until Rabbi Gamliel and the elders came along and asred this practice. The Gemara Rabbi Yossi says, no. Isser Nagubo, actually the story is just the opposite. There was a story of a shul in Tiberia where they actually assered the use of this bolt until when? Ubar Rabbi Gamliel v'askinu v'etiru until Rabbi Gamliel and the elders came along and they permitted this practice. Okay, it says the machlokes, so what exactly happened in Tiberia? I will say, but bottom line, here's the machlokes. The issue of putting the bolt back and forth into the door on Shabbos, is that tantamount to an act of binyan? Right? Does that look like an act of building or not? That is the fundamental shayla. So machlokes. Rabbi Yossi ultimately says that it's mutter. Rabbi Eliezer says that it is asur. Says the Gemara, here we go. Benitel ba'agdo kuli amalo pligi. Shabbos said, listen to this. Look at Rashi. Benitel ba'agdo kishu kasher v'talui b'chevel shel kayama v'reli taltlo ayidei osa chevel ve'ino nifsak biyadei kuli amalo pligi. I'm just reading the next Rashi. The shari dechevan the kasher v'talui yafa mucha milsa delino kai v'lo michsik. Shabbos say, watch this. Everyone agrees that if the bolt is tied to the door, and it's tied with the type of rope that is strong enough that you could pick up the bolt by the rope, everyone agrees under those circumstances that the bolt is not problematic, right? That you could put the bolt back and forth into the door. Why, Rabbi say? Because since the bolt is attached to the door in such a permanent fashion, therefore, again, it does not look like you're building, but rather, again, it's clear that the bolt ultimately, again, is a bolt. So it says the Gemara, keep ligi. So where does the machlokes come up? Top of kuf beis. So we'll say, what happens if the bolt is tied to the door, right? The bolt is tied to the door, but it's tied to the door with a very thin rope, to the point that if you were to go ahead and lift up the bolt by the rope, the bolt would snap off. So on one hand, the bolt is attached to the door, but it's not really attached in a substantive way. Is that attachment enough to go ahead and circumvent the problem of binyan, of bona? Because let's remember again, what does attachment do? What attachment does is it already, let me take a step back. When do you transgress binyan, bona? When you add something onto a structure. But if bepashtos, the item was already part of the structure, then it could be argued that putting it back and forth is not really an active bonus. So we'll say, going back to something we learned yesterday, for example, if you have a shutter on your house, let's say again, like our type of shutter, where the shutter is attached with a hinge. We'll say everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, you could take the shutter, and you could, if you wanted to, you could close the window, open the window. Why? It's bona. It's not bona. Why not? Why not? Because the shutter is already attached. So we'll say, so everyone agrees that if the bolt is attached to the door in a substantive way, substantive as defined by a rope that is so strong that you could lift up the bolt by the rope that is attached, and putting the bolt back and forth is not problematic. But what's the machlokes? What happens in a case where the bolt is attached, but it's attached in a flimsy way? So the rope with which it is attached can't support the weight of the bolt. So Demar Savar came on the Ishbarosha Glustura, Torah's Kliyalav. So I'll say one opinion will say, well, listen, at the end of the day, since it has that knob on it, therefore it has the status of a Kli. Because it has the status of a Kli, putting it into the structure does not constitute an active binyan. Umar Savar came on the Einunitel Be'igdolo. And the other opinion says, no, what we look at ultimately, again, is how is it attached to the structure? If it's attached to the structure in a permanent, semi-permanent fashion, then it's not bona. If it's not attached to the structure, if it's attached to the structure in a more flimsy fashion, even if it has that bolt at the end of it, ultimately, again, it is not considered attached, and therefore, again, it will be a problem of binyan. So we'll say, Salacha l'maisa, that is the machlokes. The way that the Shulchan Aruch paskins in this case is like Rabbi Yossi, that as long as the bolt has a knob at the end of it, it has a status of a kli, it won't be a problem to put it in. Now we're going to qualify that in just a bit. Next, Mishnah. Nagar ha-nigrar, no lebamikdash. We'll say now again some very interesting sugyas, right? Again, very interesting sugyas. So the Gemara says as follows. Nagar ha-nigrar, which is a bolt which drags. A bolt which drags. So it says, look at Rashi. Nagar ha-nigrar, Rashi says, shekasher bedelas. I'm about to say now in this case over here, it's tied to the structure. It's tied to the wall, to the door, sorry. Aval ino talui, shachevel aruch, umitoch shenigrar, Eino nira kekasher ukishein barosha gluser komos. Listen to this case. Case of Nagar Nigra is like this. The bolt is tied to the door, but I will say it's a very long rope. So therefore, what? The bolt lays on the ground. So it's attached. It lays on the ground. I will say now again. Rashi points out, as opposed to the last Mishnah, where there was a knob on the bolt. There's no knob in this case. So here again, you have attachments. You have attachment, but the rope is very long, and therefore the bolt lies on the ground. So what's the halacha? So nolan bo b'mikdash. Shabbos say you could use it in the Beis Hamikdash, aval lo b'medina, but ultimately again not outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Right? You could use it in the Beis Hamikdash, but not outside the Beis Hamikdash. So Rashi says there nolan bo b'mikdash. Jerry, hashkacha, that mamish, you're sitting right by the kosel. Mamish. First time we've had a sugya by Jerry's learning daf by the kosel in Yerushalayim. So now we have a first time ever mention of the Beis Hamikdash, right? I don't know if it's the first time mentioned in the entire Eruvin, but pretty auspicious. Okay, good. You'll represent us all. So listen to this. Nolim bo b'mikdash shalom medina. So we'll say you could go ahead and close the door with it in the Beis Hamikdash, but not outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Now we'll say, now what's the pshat? Look at Rashi. Nolim bo b'mikdash the shvus ba'almahu. Now we'll say, listen to this. So let me read. I'll read Rashi, then I'll explain it. The shus ba'alma, it's only the rabbanon. The eino bona mamish hol v'kasher lekach elahol v'nigrar nichsei kibona ve'in shvus d'rabbanon b'mikdash d'lo gozish. We'll say, listen to this. So now, what's the problem with putting this bolt back into the threshold, put it back into the door? Both say it's certainly not biblical. Why is it not a biblical act of bona, even though there's no knob on the bolt? Because remember, the bolt is attached. Remember, once you're attached, that's a pretty good indicator that you're already part of the structure. But yet, midrabanan, we're not happy with this attachment. Why? Because the bolt is dragging, right? Or I should say again, the rope is not taut, so therefore the bolt is on the ground. So listen to this. Outside of the Beis Hamikdash, you cannot put such a bolt like that back in your door, because midrabanan it will be asr because it has the appearance of building. They will say there is a concept of ein shvus b'mikdash, which means isurim dirabanan do not apply in the Beis Hamikdash. A general principle. So therefore, the Gemara says something amazing. Nagar hanigrar. If you have a bolt that's dragging on the ground, so outside of the Beis Hamikdash, you can't use it because it's asr dirabanan. But there are no Isurei D'Rabbanan in the Mikdash, and therefore you could use such a bolt in the Beis HaMikdash. Incredible. Aval Medina. Va'munach. Rabbi say, what about munach? Munach is a bolt that is not attached to the door at all. Rather, is just lying on the ground. So therefore, again, Rabbi say, everyone agrees that putting that type of bolt back into the door is an act of binyan, is an act of building. Kan v'kan aser. Ultimately, it will be aser outside of the Beis Hamikdash and inside the Beis Hamikdash. Rabbi Huda says, hamunach muter b'mikdash v'hanigra b'medina. Rabbi Huda disagrees. Rabbi Huda says that a munach, ultimately, again, even if the bolt is not attached and it's lying on the ground, you could put that back into the doorway in the Beis Hamikdash, because Rabbi Huda holds that even that act of putting an unattached bolt into the door, is not binyan. It's not real building. It's only with Rabbanon. And remember again, Yisrei Rabbanon don't apply in the Beis Hamikdash. And Nigrar, the dragging bolt, ultimately again will be permitted outside of the Beis Hamikdash. So we'll say it's a fundamental machlokes. Here we go. Tan Rabbanon Ezehu Nagar had Nigrar Shenolad b'Mikdash Shalom Medina. We'll say what's the case of Nagar had Nigrar, which we'll say again remember is the dragging bolt. So remember again, the dragging bolt. Let's clarify, is attached to the doorway, so there it is attached, but lamaisa, again, obviously it looks like it's just laying there on the ground, but it actually is attached. So now the Brisa says, what's the case of the dragging bolt that ultimately, again, is permitted in the Beis Hamikdash, but asr outside of the Beis Hamikdash? Kol shekashar v'talui, any bolt that is that is tied to the door, v'taloi, it hangs there, v'rosho echad magia la'aretz, and literally you're going to both say at least one part of it touches the ground. So we'll say, so meaning the case of Nagar HaNigrar is where at least one side of that bolt is touching the ground. That's possible, it's two sides of the bolt also. The point over here is it's not hanging off the ground, it's attached, but not hanging, not suspended. Rabbi Huda says, so we'll say, so that's the case, according to the first approach in the Mishnah, according to the Tanna Kama, Nagar HaNigrar will be Aser outside of the Beis HaMikdash, mutter inside of the Beis HaMikdash. Now again, remember, and according to the Tanna Kama, everybody agrees that munach, if it's not attached at all, will be aser even in the mikdash. Rabbi Huda comes along and he says, no, munach is even mutter out in the Beis HaMikdash itself, and nigrar is mutter outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Rabbi Huda says, af zebe medina mutter. No, that's not true. Nagar hanigrar is mutter even outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So what's the case of a bolt which can be used inside of the Beis HaMikdash but not outside? So we'll say if you have a bolt that is not tied, obviously not suspended, totally detached, to the point that what Rabbi say, when you're using it for the door, it's in the door, but you're not using it for the door, you mamish put it somewhere else. So we'll say it's totally detached from the doorway or from the threshold. In this case, Rabbi Huda will say that halacha l'maisa, you can use such a bolt like that in the Beis HaMikdash, because even using an unattached bolt, a detached bolt, is only aser midrabanan, but you cannot use it inside, you cannot use it outside of the Beis HaMikdash. The Gemara says, furthermore, Am Rabbi Huda, Amar Shmuel, halacha ke Rabbi Huda ben Nigrar. And also Rabbi Huda says in the name of Shmuel that the halacha follows Rabbi Huda in Nigrar. Now, both remember again, what's Rabbi Huda's shita in Nigrar? Rabbi Huda holds that Nigrar is mutter even outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Now, I want to point out over here, and Rashi points this out as well. Well, look at Rashi. Halach Rabbi Huda ben Nigrar, the mutter afilu b'medina. Rabbi Huda holds Nagar HaNigrar, which means a bolt that is attached, but is on the ground, so it's not suspended, is mutter even outside of the Beis HaMikdash. He holds that's not even asur midrabanan. Rashi says, avalo b'munach the shel Rabbi Huda b'mikdash less hilchas hakavasei techevan sheino kasher sham binyan gamrahu kishar negarim shenoatzim biksalim va'abona koshu chay melachim da'araiselo. We're supposed to listen to this. So Rashi is pointing out that halacha follows Rabbi Huda b'nagar hanigrar. So we'll say in a dragging bolt, then halacha l'maisa you could use that outside of the Beis HaMikdash. But munach, which is the case when the bolt is totally detached, Rashi points out the halacha doesn't follow Rabbi Huda, because the act of taking an unattached bolt and inserting that into the door or into the threshold on Shabbos could be a malacha d'oraisa, which will be aser of binyan, which will be aser both in the Beis HaMikdash as well as b'Medina. Amar Rava. So we'll say, so that's item number one. The Gemara just established the halacha follows Rabbi Huda, benagar hanigrar, and therefore the dragging bolt, which is attached but is not suspended, rests on the ground, is going to be permitted both inside of the Beis HaMikdash as well as outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Next, Amar Rava, however, a couple of qualifications. V'husha kasha b'dalas. So Rava says, but this is true only when, ultimately, when the bolt is tied to the door itself. Tied to the door itself. So when does Rabbi Yehuda say that, or when does the Gemara say that the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda benagar hanigrar? Only when the bolt is attached mamish to the door. Ini, is that so? V'ha Rabbi Tavla ikla lemechuza. Rabbi Tavla, that's his name. Rabbi Tavla went to Mechuza, v'chaza lahahu dahu tali be'ivra dedasha, and he saw a bolt that was tied ultimately, again I will say, be'ivra dedasha means the threshold, right? The threshold, right? Or it could be the area, it could be a beam below the door or above the door. But one thing that it's not referring to is what? The door, right? So Rabbi Tavla saw a bolt that was tied to a different part of the entrance that was not the door. And he didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that it appears that the bolt doesn't have to be attached to the door. Maybe all you need is what? Is for the bolt to be attached to some part of the entranceway. To which the Gemara says, no, hahu nita bi'igdo hava. That case was different. Why? We'll say that was a case of a bolt that was tied with a very strong rope. The rope so strong that if you lifted up the bolt by the rope, ultimately, again, the rope would not snap. So both say, so it's possible in a case where the rope is so strong and it tethers the bolt to the structure in such a substantive, permanent way, in that case, even if the bolt is not tied to the door, but it's tied to some other part of the threshold, that's going to be okay. So we'll say, so another couple of qualifications. So it appears, so number one, Nagar HaNigrar is mutter even outside of the Beis HaMikdash. That's Aleph. Beis, ideally Nagar HaNigrar should be tied to the door. But apparently if it's not tied to the door, if it's tied to another part of the structure with a strong rope, that's going to be okay as well. Rav Avia Ikl in Arda. What's this? Rav Avia went in Arda. So he saw a man who tied the bolt to the structure with a reed. With a reed. Amar din lo nitrok. Rashi says din lo nitrok. Ze lo yino. She'eno kasher de command less of the. So we'll say, so in this case, Rabbi Avia said, you can't use that bolt on Shabbos. Why? Because we'll say, that's not even a nagar hanigrar. Why not? Because we'll say, a reed is nothing. And that could snap easily. So apparently, halacha l'maisa, in order for the bolt to be attached to the structure, it has to be tied with something substantive. If it's something that's going to snap relatively easily, then ultimately, again, the nagar is not considered attached to the structure. By Rabbi Zera, nikmaz mahu. We'll say, what's the case of, so what's nikmaz? Look at Rashi. Nikmaz mahu, shenichnas hanagar b'chari sikufa, v'nifchas o soachar, the nifchas o sachar the yotzi hanagar letzara karka v'noitz bekarka v'atashtari kishes kufa gavoa ve'inachor nikayos. We'll say, what happens if you have what happens if you have a bolt that goes into the ground itself? So remember again, up until now we're dealing with a bolt that really just attached the door to a threshold. What happens if the bolt goes into the ground itself? That's nikmaz. Amar Rav Yosef, mighty baile. I don't understand what exactly is the kasha. What's the kasha? Mighty baile. Lo shmiya le hadisayin. Did you not hear that which we learned in the following brisa? Nishmat aser, nikmaz mutter. We'll say, look at Rashi. Nishmat nifsak hakevashu kasher bo. If you have a bolt that was attached by a rope, but the rope broke on Shabbos, you certainly can't put the bolt back into the door. However, nikmaz mutter. But we'll say ultimately again, if the bolt goes into the ground, then it's going to be mutter. Rabbi Huda says nikmaz afapi she'enu nishmat aser. And ultimately again, Rabbi Huda says if it's nikmaz, even if it's not nishmat, it's going to be aser. Rabbi Huda benikmaz, and Rav Yehuda said the name of Shmuel that the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda in the case of nikmaz. V'taima mai. What's the reason? Amar Abaye mishum de mechse kibona. Because we'll say ultimately again with a bolt that goes actually into the ground, then ultimately that really does look like binyan, that really does look like building, and therefore it'll be problematic. Good. So let's listen to this next case. Rav Nuchumi bar Zechariah asked Abaye the following kasha. Oselo beis yad mahu. But it's an interesting case. What happens if you make a handle for the nagar, for the bolt? Look at Rashi. Asalo beis yad lenagar. So we'll say, what happens if you go out and you make a handle for the bolt? She'eno kasher klal v'tachav beis yad be'emsiso v'domel lemakeves tahashta v'adei muchadu deklihu malro. So we'll say we're going back a little bit. Remember how this discussion started? We started with a bolt that had a knob. Right? And the reason we started there is because the shaila was, perhaps there's no problem putting that back into the door on Shabbos, even if it's not attached. Why? Because that is a status of a what? Of what? Of a kli. So now we're reverting back to that a little bit. What happens if what do I keep on forgetting? The bolt. Keep on forgetting the English word. Right? What happens if the bolt has a handle? So we'll say, does the fact that it has a handle, by definition, identify it as a kli, which should then allow you to put it back and forth into the door, in reality, even if it's not attached to the door. Because we'll say, once it's a kli, therefore what? There's no binyan, right? That's the underlying assumption we're working over here. If something is a kli, then putting it back into, that's not called bona, that's not called binyan. So if it has a handle, does that make it a kli? And therefore, obviate the concern of binyan. So the Gemara says, Amar lahu, buchna ka'amrit. So he said to him, well, if that's the case, that you have a bolt, ultimately, again, with a handle, that's called a pestle, right? We'll say that's something you could use to grind up, so that definitely has the status of a kli. So the Gemara Rashi is buchna kamer tavadai shari buchna makeves akoshin bochitin. We'll say, right, that's a mortar, and like a mortar, right? The mortar, right, or pestle, right? That's ultimately again something you use to go ahead and grind up things. If you have, right, if you could imagine, if you have a bolt with a handle, you can use it to crush stuff. Okay, so ultimately that's a kli, and therefore that wouldn't be a problem. Itmar. Amrav Nuchumi Barada, Asala Beis Yad Mutter. So most same idea. Nuchumi Barada says if the bolt has a handle, if a bolt has a handle, it may be moved on Shabbos. In other words, it can be put back and forth into the structure. Hahu Sharisa, Dahavu Be Rabbi Pedas, Davu Madlu Be Asra. Both say getting to a very interesting sugya. There was a Sharisa. We'll say, what's Sharisa? So Rashi says, Korah, a large beam. A large beam. Rashi says, so the Gemara says, there was a very large beam that was in the home of Rabbi Pedas. It took 10 people to move it. Both say first wide line, Kuf Beis and Aleph. And what would happen, both say, in the house of Rabbi Pedas, 10 people would lift up the beam. They would put it by the door for security measures. Right? At night, I guess they'd go to sleep. They'd put the large beam by the door. And Rabbi Pedas didn't say anything. Now, both say, now, Bepashtos, such a beam like this should be muktzah, right? What do you do? A beam is used for binyan, for building. So b'pashtos, why are they allowed to move it on Shabbos? And Rabbi Pedas didn't say anything to them. To which the Gemara says, Torah's kli aleha. He didn't say anything because ultimately, again, that beam has the status of a kli. Why does that have status? Rashi says, because you could use it as a bench. You could sit on it. So because it's possible to sit on it, therefore halach l'maaseh it has status of a utensil. If it has the status of a utensil, it's not muktzah. It's not muktzah. Incredible. Hahu asisa dahavi bei mar Shmuel tava machzekes adibra. So we'll say similar idea. There was a very large mortar that was in the house of Mar Shmuel that ultimately again held an incredible amount. Rashi says over here. Rashi says adriba lesechitin chatzikor. It held half a core, so it was a very large mortar. Shari Mar Shmuel adasha, and again, same idea. Shmuel permitted people to move it and put it by the doorway to block the door as a security measure. So the Gemara says, why? So the Gemara says, Amar Torah's kli aleh, same idea. The large beam is not muktzah because it has the status of a kli. Why does it have the status of a kli? Because it can be used as a bench. So we'll say again, not directly related ultimately to what we said before, because before we were talking about the issue vis-a-vis binyan. But again, once we started on that topic, we're discussing now about moving of items that have the appearance of being used for binyan. But again, since they ultimately can be repurposed as a bench, therefore there's no muktzah and movement was permitted. Shalach le Rami bar Yecheskel Rav Amram. Neima lanmar mehalin mili mal yasa da amraton mishmei Ravasi. Bikipi da arba. So we'll say fascinating sugya. So listen to this. Rami bar Yecheskel son Rav Amram. Tell me some good stuff that you learned from Rav Asi when it comes to the arches of a boat. Now, both say, let's take a look at Rashi for just a moment. What do you mean the arches of the boat? Look at Rashi. Kipi da'arba. So Rashi says over here, Ulmos sha'osim b'sfina, shenolin ke'ein ma'aglin she'korin sarko, rosha echa b'dofen shazetvina, v'rosha sheni b'dofen zeh, v'kar. Both say, let me just explain this to you for just a moment. So what used to happen is as follows. They would have boats. The boats would have like these, they call it archways. Right, so essentially the boat would have a frame on top of it, right? What would you do with the frame? So you would put like sheets or material, canvas or something over the frame so as to create shade when you were transporting something, transporting items, or just when a person was on the boat. So the boat itself had the frame, but the cover was a removable cover. So listen to this, I will say. Shalach le, Ravasi said, Hani kipi da'arba. So I will say these archways of the boat, Bisman sheish and tefach. If the archways, we'll say if each arch is actually a tefach wide, inami ein ban tefach ve'ein bein zelazeh shlosha. We'll say, or even if each archway is not a tefach wide, but there's less than 3 tefachim in between each archway. We'll say, what happens if there's less than 3 tefachim in between each archway? Right, lavud. Then what? Listen to this. L'machar mevi machatzelos upori salehen. Ultimately, we'll say, just want to point out to you, what's the shaila? We'll say, so imagine for a moment, my boat is in dry dock, right? My boat is in dry dock. I decide, you know what, I'd love to have Shabbos lunch on the boat. Who doesn't want to have Shabbos lunch on a boat? So we'll say, so what happens? I go to my boat, it's very sunny. So what do I want to do? I want to take out my cover, and I want to go ahead and spread it over the archways. I will say, what's the potential issue involved over here? Ohel. You can't build a structure. You can't build a tent. You can't build a structure on Shabbos. You can't, by the way, even build an impermanent structure on Shabbos. So listen to this. So says, now the Gemara says, well, it depends. If the archways of the boats themselves, if each archway is at least a tefach wide, or even if it's not a tefach wide, but they're less than 3 tefachim, I will say, then what? Then that boat is already considered to be an ohel arai. But we'll say the definition of an impermanent structure is one that has a roof that is at least 1 tefach wide. Once you already have that, well, let's see. So therefore, again, I'll say the Gemara says, if this is going to be, you're going to see, it's going to have an incredible halacha l'maaseh component. So if the archways themselves are at least a tefach wide, or if halacha l'maaseh, the archways themselves are less than 3 tefachim away from each other, therefore there is labud. What's the halacha about saying? The halacha is maybe machatzelis. The next day on Shabbos you could bring the sheet or whatever, that's a better word for sheet. The canopy. Good, thank you. You can bring the canopy. Upores alena, and you could spread it over the archways. My time, what's the reason? Mosif al ohel arayhu b'shapir dami. Both say, listen to this. The halacha is, you may not create an ohel aray, an impermanent structure on Shabbos, but if one is already there, then what? You are permitted to add on to it. What's the definition of an impermanent structure, ohel aray? Something that has a roof space of at least a tefach. As long as it has at least a roof space of a tefach wide, you could add on to that. So as long as the archways themselves are at least a tefach wide, or again, if they're not a tefach wide, but they're within 3 tefachim of each other, ultimately you could add on to it. You could put on the canopy on Shabbos. Incredible. Hano dichri, both say there were these sheep that belonged to Rav Huna. To be imama bo'tula, by day they needed shade because of the sun. Ubalayla bo'avira, but at night the fresh air was good for them. Bless you. Also, they came before Rav. So I'll say, so remember, again, this came up ultimately again on Shabbos. So the Shaila Rabbosai is, remember, so at night, Shabbos night, there was no canopy over the sheep. But by day, they want to put the canopy back. So can they put the canopy back over the sheep on Shabbos? So I was going to Rav, Amarle, Zil Kurach Budja, Bishayir Beit Tefach. Here's what you do. Before Shabbos starts, and you want it, because remember, at night, they want the canopy open, roll up the canopy, but leave at least 1 tefach of the canopy extended. And then tomorrow, as long as there is already 1 tefach of canopy open at the onset of Shabbos, there's no problem to go ahead and roll out the rest of the canopy. So we'll say, so by the way, this has incredible halacha l'maaseh ramifications, right? For strollers. I will say on a technical level, if a person has a stroller, the baby in a stroller, so extending the canopy all the way is a problem of building ohel aray. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. So everybody say, if you do that, that's mamish ohel aray. Again, it's an issur d'rabbanan. But if the canopy is open at least a tefach at the onset of Shabbos, then there's absolutely no problem with extending it or even taking it back any further. And both say, that's not from the sugya. Ohel aray, you can't create an ohel aray on Shabbos. But if an ohel aray already existed prior to the onset of Shabbos, extending it or detracting from it is not problematic. Incredible. Amarav mishum Rabbi Chia. Vilon mutul toso mutul farko b'Shabbos. Let's listen to this. A vilon is just a curtain. There's no problem with putting up a curtain and taking down a curtain on Shabbos. So in other words, we'll say that a curtain doesn't have the status of an ohel aray. So because of that, again, there's no problem. Kilas chasanim. So it's like kilas chasanim is a canopy bed. Now understand their canopy beds are probably a little bit different. What they call it a bridal canopy is different than the way of thinking about it. Like today, a canopy bed, I think, right, is like you have 4 posts and there's a canopy over it. That wasn't your type of canopy bed. They had 2 posts. One situated in the middle by the head and one situated by the middle by the feet. And ultimately, again, the canopy came down like a tent. So we'll say, so the kilas chasanim is not a problem. Rashi says, I'm sorry, let's just look at the word. Kilas chasanim mutar farko ulintosu b'Shabbos. You could put up, you could take down a kilas chasanim. I will say why. It's always the same idea. Because since there is no tefach, a flat roof, that's not even called an ohel aray. Well, so this is halacha l'maaseh, that ultimately, again, the only time something is an ohel aray is to have at least 1 tefach, a flat roof space. Because the kilas chasanim comes to a point. There's no tefach, a flat roof space. Therefore, there's no problem putting it up and taking it down. Rashi says over here, Rashi says, no, not yet, sorry. Yeah, kilas chasan Rashi lav oelu mipnei she'ein lagag lamala rochav tefach mipnei shehu nesuna b'shipua v'hi yuriya sheparsin sav lemita liyashin. So we'll say again, because there is no rooftop of a tefach, therefore it's not a problem. The Yuzar says Amar Rav Sheshes Brei Dravidi Lor Amar Ela she'ein begago tefach. Okay, we'll say when can you put up and take down all of these structures? When halacha l'maisa there is no at least one tefach, a flat roof. But if there is a tefach, a flat roof space, aser. Furthermore, again, when we say that if there's not a roof space of a tefach, that is mutter. Both say that's also if what? That's also even if there's one tefach of space within 3 tefachim of the top of the roof, that's also problematic. So we'll say you could see. We're getting mamish to the end over here. This is picture 360, at least in my last picture we have. So we'll say remember we've already established that halacha l'maisa, if there's a tefach at the top of the space, it's certainly problematic. Now the Gemara is adding in, by the way, even if there's one tefach of space, of airspace, right, interior space, within 3 tefachim of the top of the bed, that's also problematic. So we'll say a little bit of a new definition of ol arai. One tefach of space at the top. But even if you have one tefach of space, interior space, within 3 tefachim of the top, that's also problematic. So the Gemara says, furthermore, again, I will say, if you don't have a tefach of interior space within 3 tefachim to the top, that's also only problematic. Ella b'she'ein amud beis, b'she'ein b'shipua tefach. I will say that's only if the slope itself doesn't accumulate the area of a tefach. We'll say, but again, if the slope goes in such a way that the slope creates an interior space of one tefach, that's also problematic. V'amar Rav Shisha Brei Dravidi says, Saina Shari. Saina is permitted. We'll say, what's Saina? We'll say, it's very interesting. Rashi says, Kova Shalavad Shekorin Paltri Mutra Shabbos. We'll say, felt hat. You could wear a felt hat on Shabbos. The Gemara says, really? Vatanya Aser. But we'll say ultimately again we saw that a felt hat is asur. We'll say now what is going on over here? What could be wrong with the hat? We'll say everything depends on how large the brim is. If the brim is more than a tefach, then ultimately we'll say that is the status of an ohel arai, of an impermanent structure. Right? An impermanent structure, therefore that could be problematic. So I don't say really. So if you put something over your head that's a tefach, that suddenly becomes an all the right. So tell me, if you're wearing a coat or you're wearing a cloak and you pull your cloak over your head so that it extends over your head, right? You have a hood. Right? So for that matter, again, if you ever try to wear the hood of your shena coat without a hat, right? So we'll say so that means again. So if I have a hood that extends over my head, a tefach, that's an ohel arai. To which the Gemara says, Elokashya, hademe hadik, hadelo mehadik. To which the Gemara says, here's the distinction. We'll say, look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, V'taima lo mishum uhal. We'll say, you're right. The issue with the felt hat is actually not an issue of ohel arai. Rather, Ela dilma nafal mereishe ve'asila asuye. We'll say the felt hat was a Masechah Shabbos issue that comes up with items that you're not allowed to wear out of concern that they're going to fall off, and you may come to carry it. So when the Brisa says you can't wear a felt hat, what it means is you can't wear a hat that doesn't fit you well, because then there's a concern that what's going to happen? It's going to blow off, and you're going to come to carry it. But if the hat fits you well, ultimately, again, there is no problem to wear it on Shabbos. And Abosai, again, once something has the status of a malbush, of an article of clothing, then it cannot become an ohel arai. Good. So we'll say ultimately, Elokasha hadim hadik hadalo mehadik. Good. Rashi says, Hilcha ki mehadik v'kasha beritzua tachasavaro shavla asar. We'll say it's interesting enough. The way they wore their felt hat was that it had like a little string that came beneath the chin as well, chin strap. So once it was well fitting and it was embedded on the head, then Allah l'mayis, that's not a problem. Good. I will say really a fascinating. So again, just point out that sugya of all arai is clearly very halacha l'mayis for us as well. Next, Mishnah. Machzirin sira tachton mikdash avaloh medina. So let's listen to this. We'll say a tzir is a pivot, right? A pivot in the door. So listen to this. You can go ahead and put back in the bottom pivot of a door in the Beis Hamikdash, but aval lo b'Medina, but not outside of the Beis Hamikdash. So it's interesting. There's no picture. I think they got a little lazy at the end of Eruvin. I think because there's you're going to see there's a couple of things that pictures would have actually been very helpful for. I think they ran out of juice. See, Baruch Hashem, it's very validating. They ran out of steam by the end of the Masechta. No more pictures for the last couple of blocks. But all right, Machzirin Sir Hatachton Mikdash Shalom Medina. You could put back in the bottom pivot of a door in the Beis Hamikdash, but not outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Look at Rashi. Machzirin Sir Hatachton. I both say this is dafka the bottom pivot. You'll see why there's a distinction. Look at Rashi. Shel Deles Chalon Shida Teva Migdal. I both say. Remember, this is a door of anything. This could be a door, ultimately, again, like an entranceway. It could also be they had pivots on. They had, remember, for the shutters of windows. They also had these type of pivots, or even like in a chest, or even in a chest or in a trunk. Or migdal shepischei mitzdehen detzir tachton kolzman shlo yotza elyon noach lags yivein kamer. Let's listen to this. The way so just let's deal with like a door of a structure, just to keep it easy. So apparently, the way it used to work is like this: you'd have an upper pivot and a lower pivot. As long as the upper pivot was in place, even if the lower pivot got a little dislodged, it was easy to bump back in. And it would not compromise the usage of the door. So what the Gemara is saying is like this. If the bottom pivot gets dislodged in the base, so to put that back in is really only an Issur D'Rabbanan. There's no binyan, there's no bona there. So we'll say because it's only an Issur D'Rabbanan, and as we said before, Isurei D'Rabbanan do not apply in the Beis HaMikdash. Therefore, knocking that pivot back in the Beis HaMikdash is mutter. Outside of the Beis HaMikdash will be asr. Va'lo b'Medina. Va'elyon, but I will say if the upper pivot gets dislodged, then I will say what? Kan v'kan asr. Then ultimately, again, putting it back in both in the Mikdash and the Medina will be asr. Because again, based on what we said before, that halacha l'maisa, Rashi says the chayvan sheyatze elyon kulo nofel. We'll say when the upper pivot comes out of the door, it renders the door almost unusable, right? So I will say, therefore, again, the act of putting the upper pivot back in place, that's really boneh midaraisa. That's real binyan. So once you're dealing with daraisas, you can't do it in the Beis HaMikdash or outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Huda says, ha'elyon b'mikdash v'atachom medina. So also Rabbi Huda says that halacha l'maisa, the elyon is permitted in the Beis HaMikdash, and the tachton is permitted in the Medina. Okay, so let's analyze. We'll say, here we go. Tzir deles shida umigdal. So we'll say if you have the pivot. Again, deles is like the door to an entranceway. Shida teva migdal is literally, again, a tower, a chest, a dresser. So what's the halacha? But mikdash machzirin. In the Beis HaMikdash, you can knock it back in. B'Medina dochakin. So we'll say in the Beis HaMikdash, you could mamish return the pivot to its place. In the Medina, the Brisa says over here, dochakin. Now we'll say dochakin means that as long as the bottom pivot has not come out fully, you could kind of push it back into place. Va'elyon, but the upper pivot, kan vekan lo yachzir. The upper pivot, I will say, if it comes out, whether it's in the Mikdash or the Medina, is going to be totally yasir, because I will say putting the upper pivot back into the threshold ultimately again has the status of bona. Gezerah shema yitaka. Oh, I'm sorry. Va'elyon kan vekan lo yachzir gezerah shema yitaka. Because I will say the concern then is your mamish going to bang it back into place, right? You're going to go ahead and really embed it firmly, and that could be a real issue of bona. V'imtaka chayiv chatos, and indeed, both say if the upper pivot got dislodged and you banged it back into place, halacha l'maisa it is an isur daraisa. Chayiv chatos shal bor v'shal dus shal yitzia. I will say, what if we're talking about over here the pivot of a doorway that covered a pit or a cistern, or yitzia is literally an annex. Lo yachzir. Ultimately, again, you should not really return that pivot to place. Ve'im hechzer chayiv chatos, and if you did so, ultimately, again, you'd be chayav b'chatos. Good. So it's an interesting distinction between upper pivot, lower pivot, Beis HaMikdash, outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Mishnah. Rabbi, fascinating sugya now. Machzirin ritia b'mikdash avalom din. Rabbi, listen to this case. Now we're transitioning a little bit, totally new topic. So ritia, look at Rashi. Rashi in the Mishnah will say it's in the intermediate wide lines, second line in. Machzir Tiya. We need this introduction. Kohen shalaka biyado v'nasan alei aratim b'yom. So here's the case. A Kohen got an injury. Friday, Kohen gets an injury on his hand. So what does he do? He puts on a bandage on top of the injury. Right? V'chutzrach la'avod avodah b'Shabbos or b'Yom Tov. Rabbi said, remember, now come Shabbos or Yom Tov, he has to do the avodah. He's got to start in the Beis HaMikdash. V'nato ritiya me'al yado. Rabbi said the halacha is, when a Kohen does the avodah, there could be no chatzitza between his hand on his hand. So therefore, if a Kohen cannot do the avoda with a bandage on his hands. So what happens? He gets injured Friday afternoon, or Friday, whatever it is, puts on the bandage, comes Shabbos, he wants to do the avoda, he takes the bandage off in order to be able to do the avoda appropriately. So what happens? So Rashi says, Shalote chotzetzes beino uben yado le'avoda. The chatzitza poseles ba, de bo'inon v'lokach hakohen. The kevan dechayetz lo havi lekicha b'kohen. So we'll say, so now what happened over here? So the pasuk is, the Kohen has to take, and in order for it to be a taking by the Kohen, it has to be the Kohen's hand without any chatzitza. So good. So he takes off the bandage on Shabbos in order to be able to do the avoda. Now what happens? Now we'll say, now what happens after he does the avoda? He finishes the avoda. It's 10 o'clock Shabbos morning. What does he want to do? He wants to put the bandage back on. So look at Rashi. So machzira b'mikdash. Ultimately, again, we allow him to put the bandage back on in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, why is this? Says Rashi. Di'ilo sharuzei lachzir lo shakile miyada o mimana v'lo avid avoda. So let's listen to this, because what are we concerned about? If we don't allow the Kohen to put the bandage back on, I will say, what may happen? What may happen? He may not take it off to begin with, and I'll end up doing the avoda in a place. Well, this is actually an incredible thing. A Kohen is not going to miss out on doing the avoda. He's just not. He's not going to give up doing the avoda. So what are we concerned about? So if you make him choose between going ahead and taking off the bandage of the avoda, and he can't put the bandage back on, he'll just do the avoda with the bandage on, which of course is problematic. The Gemara says, "Lo shakilim." I'm sorry. Because if we don't allow him to go in and take it off, and put it back on, lo shakilim yadei. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. So we'll say, so what are we concerned about? We're concerned about that if we don't let him take it off, he's not going to end up doing the avoda. We'll see a different gears than the Gemara. He's not going to come to do the avoda, and therefore, in order, and Rashi says, so therefore, we'll say, in order that we don't want the Kohen to refrain from doing the avoda, therefore we allow him to put the bandage back on Shabbos. Now we'll say, we'll see exactly what the issue with putting the bandage back on. So let's go back to the Mishnah. Machzirin ritia b'mikdash avalov medina. We'll say if you take a bandage off on Shabbos, if you did it in the Beis HaMikdash, you're allowed to put it back on. But if you took a bandage off outside of the Beis HaMikdash, you are not permitted to put it back on. Rashi says avalov medina. So listen to this. We'll say, what's now? Rashi says over here, what's the concern with the bandage? So we'll say, whenever you put on a bandage, you never just put on a bandage. What else do you put on? What else? An ointment of some sort. Well, the act of smoothing out an ointment on Shabbos is the malacha of memachek. Memachek, I will say, means smoothing out a substance or smoothing out an item. So therefore, I will say that's the issue over here. So in the Beis HaMikdash, the Gemara says we're going to let the Kohen put it back on, because if we don't let him put it back on, he's not going to come to do the avoda. But outside of the Beis HaMikdash, if you took your bandage off, you may not put the bandage back on Shabbos. However, in Betchila, I will say, what happens if a person goes ahead and puts a bandage on for the first time on Shabbos, and then ultimately again they take it off? Then halacha l'maisa kan v'kan aser. Ultimately, we'll say, if you put it on for this, so remember, all of this discussion is you put a bandage on before Shabbos. Now you want to go ahead and take it off on Shabbos. Can you put it back on Shabbos? In the Mikdash you can. Outside of the Beis HaMikdash you can't. However, in Betchila, Rashi says over in Betchila, Shalahaisek Shirim Be'od Yom. So we'll say this is a case where the bandage was not on the Erev Shabbos. I put it out on Shabbos itself. Kan v'kan aser, Rashi says. V'hacha leka l'meimar ein shuso mikdash tahavadai hay shuvos lav zorak avohu el zorak hazos. Fine. So we'll say, we'll explain this in the Gemara. So halacha l'meisa, if you put on the bandage for the first time on Shabbos, both in the Mikdash as well as outside of the Beis HaMikdash, if you took it off, you may not put it back on. So we'll say, so bottom line, if you had a bandage on before Shabbos, if the Kohen takes it off on Shabbos, you can put it back on. But outside of the Beis HaMikdash, if you take the bandage off, you may not put it back on. What's the concern? The concern is memachik, smoothing out the ointment. Says the Gemara. Tan Rabbanan, here we go. Ritia sheper shemei agabe maka. So let's listen to this. If you have a bandage that fell off, so I put a bandage on Erev Shabbos, and on Shabbos the bandage falls off. So what's the halacha? Machzirin b'Shabbos. So the Brayse says you're allowed to go ahead and put the bandage back on Shabbos. Rashi points out why. Machzirin. It's apparently it's uncommon for bandages to fall off, and therefore halacha l'maisa you're permitted to go ahead and put it back on Shabbos. So the Rabbi Yehuda says, hochla kalamata, doch kalamala. Both say, what about in the following case? Let's say the bandage doesn't fall off, but the bandage slides. So if the bandage, says Rabbi Yehuda, if the bandage slid down, you could push it back up. Lamala, doch kalamata. Or ultimately, again, if the bandage slides up, you can push it back down. So Rabbi Yehuda holds, well, say, if the bandage falls off, it seems to be that you can't put it back on. But if the bandage just slides around, you are permitted to readjust it. So we'll say furthermore, what else can you do? This is very interesting. Umegale miktas haratia, umekenech piyamaka. What you can also do on Shabbos is as follows. You could lift up part of the bandage in order to do like a little bit of wound care, right? You could lift up part of the bandage in order to clean off the top of the wound. But you must remember again, the idea over here is you lift up one end of the bandage, right? Umekanech piyamaka, the chos umegale miktas haratia, umekanech piyamaka. So we'll say what you could do is you could lift up part of the bandage at a time, and each time you lift up part of the bandage, clean part of the wound. But what's the idea? We'll say, what am I not doing over here? I'm not moving the bandage in totality, right? Because once you take off the bandage, then halacha l'maisa, there's a problem of being able to put it back on. But I will say ultimately, again, the bandage itself, you should not wipe off. Because I will say, the act of wiping off the bandage, which would be removing off the ointment, that would be an act of smoothing out. And if you went ahead and you did an act of smoothing, then einachinami, ultimately again, you would be chayiv v'chatos. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. So he says the name of Shmuel. Allah Rabbi Yehuda. The Allah of Rabbi Yehuda will say, namely, that again, that if a bandage slides, you could readjust it. Amar Rav Chisda lo shana elo shapir shagabe kli. So we'll say, you know what? Actually, we'll stop over here. We'll pick up with Emir Hashem this Amar Rabbi Yehuda that the Allah follows Rabbi Yehuda tomorrow. But understand this discussion, of course, lagabe bandages also have incredible halacha l'maisa ramifications. Emir Hashem, we'll see the halacha l'maisa tomorrow. Bosei shekayach.